What images come to mind when you think of enormous wealth and power? Greed? Corruption? Domination? Wealth and power are not inherently evil and can be used for good. But given the sinful disposition of human nature, it is almost inevitable that when enormous amounts of wealth and power are concentrated in individuals or institutions, there will be greed, corruption, and domination. History is full of such examples. In the Old Testament, King David abused his power by manipulating the death of one of his soldiers in order to take his wife. David's son, Solomon, amassed enormous wealth, by which he acquired over 1,000 wives. Some of those wives led him down the path of idolatry. In modern times, the concentration of wealth and power has produced large corporations, which by the mid-1800s practically controlled the U.S. economy. Railroad monopolies drove up the price of food and other goods by charging exorbitant transportation costs. These corporations became so large that they purchased steel and lumber mills to produce their own railroad tracks. In the process of doing so, they could exercise control over the steel and lumber markets. Governments too become greedy, corrupt, and tyrannical when they possess enormous wealth and power. In the 20th century, communist regimes seized private property and took over the production of goods and services, promising to end the oppression of workers by the rich. Instead, the Communist Party elite enriched themselves, oppressed the general populace, and systematically killed over 100 million people. So what is the solution here? How can we prevent enormous wealth and power from being concentrated in either corporations or government? In a word, checks and balances. On the economic side, the government must apply enough control to prevent the growth of business monopolies and unfair practices. This was the purpose of the antitrust laws passed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These laws prevented the large railroads from buying up smaller lines and taking over the market. The struggle continues today as large corporations become ever more resourceful in exploiting and circumventing such regulations. Since the government's role in this regard is to ensure competition and opportunity, and to protect people from unscrupulous businesses, it needs to be just large enough to accomplish this task and no larger. If the government begins to burden businesses with too many regulations or takes over parts of the economy, for example utilities or the healthcare system, then the balance of wealth and power tilts toward the government, which will produce its own brand of greed, corruption, and domination. Unlike corporations, government control is exercised through both economic and physical coercion. In other words, the government can take away your money and your property, and the government has guns. There's no doubt that greedy and corrupt businesses have perpetrated numerous injustices, but they don't kill millions of people or send people to gas chambers. Historically, the greatest crimes against humanity were committed by government power, not corporate power. The Founding Fathers were well aware of such dangers and were keen to limit the reach of the federal government by carefully enumerating its powers in the Constitution, leaving a considerable amount of power to individual states. They realized that across the longer arc of history, the concentration of wealth and power in a centralized government would end in tyranny. But today there are many well-meaning people in our nation who ignore the lessons of history and believe that large, centralized government is a benign entity and will always have the best interest of its people in mind. This may be true in some instances for a time, but inevitably, as we have seen, the enormous concentration of wealth and power vested in the federal government, and sometimes even in state governments, will be our undoing. The trend lines of history are clear, even from recent events. Here are a few examples. In 2010, Congress passed the Affordable Care Act, a federal law that requires all U.S. citizens to purchase health care. The provisions of the bill also force Christian businesses and institutions for the first time ever to provide contraceptives that may produce an abortion by preventing a fertilized egg from implanting in the uterus. In 2014, Hobby Lobby, a Christian-owned business, prevailed against this government mandate by 1 vote in the Supreme Court. Similar cases with less certain outcomes are making their way through the courts, forcing Christian organizations to pay millions of dollars in legal fees to continue exercising their religious beliefs. Over the past several years, Christian bakers and photographers in different states who refused to support gay wedding ceremonies by providing goods and services were heavily fined, forcing some to close. The issue for these Christians was not the sexual orientation of their customers, but the violation of their deeply held religious beliefs regarding the sanctity of marriage. In fact, some businesses had previously provided goods and services to the very same customers that filed against them, knowing full well that they were gay. In the summer of 2015, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down state laws which refused to grant legal recognition to gay marriage. Many of those laws were established by popular referendum, but the court, usurping the powers that in the Constitution are left to the state, effectively redefined marriage in a way that has no precedent in human history until very recently. The decision was passed by a margin of only 1 vote. These cases exemplify the growing shadow of government domination. Long-standing, deeply held, and widely practiced religious beliefs can be criminalized practically overnight when the government moves to impose its own social agenda. And things will only get worse as government continues to amass more wealth and power. Yet there are those who believe we must fundamentally change our economy and enlarge our government in order to achieve prosperity and social justice. But the cure would prove to be worse than the disease. They fail to realize that every type of economy and every form of government has a dark side, including both socialism and capitalism. The reality is that the balance of wealth and power will never be totally just and equitable because every government and every economy can be corrupted. Indeed, the naive belief that we can create an ideal society here on Earth has led to the most coercive forms of government in history. The design of communism was to end class struggle and economic injustice by redistributing wealth. Instead, it empowered government elites, oppressed people, removed the incentives to self-betterment, and impoverished entire countries. The only system that can minimize the concentration of enormous wealth and power is a regulated market economy where competition thrives, and a constitutionally limited government that regards intervention in society as a measure of last resort.